All right, welcome all to the final Kitab talk in our spring series. My name is Emma Harver, and I'm the Director of Outreach for the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. This series is a collaboration of the UNC Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies and the UNC University Libraries. And I'd really like to thank Rustin Zarkar, our librarian for Middle East and Islamic Studies, for putting together this fantastic series of talks over the past year. And in our virtual environment, it's been great that we've been able to offer these online and highlight various digital resources and collections for learning and teaching about the Middle East. So thank you all so much for coming today. We're really thrilled to hear from Dr. Michael Erdman about the British Library's Turkish and Turkic collections. And with that, I will turn it over to Rustin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. As Emma mentioned, I am Rustin Zarkar. I'm the Middle East and Islamic Studies librarian at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I just want to thank Emma so much for co-organizing this Kitab Talk series with me over the last year. It's been fantastic. We've had some wonderful speakers and presentations. And I'm really excited to introduce our latest and last speaker of the semester, Dr. Michael Erdman, who will be talking about the Turkish and Turkic collection at the British Library. So Dr. Michael Erdman is the curator of Turkish and Turkic collections at the British Library. He's received his PhD from the SOAS University of London for his dissertation, which compared historical narratives of ethnogenesis in Turkey and Soviet Central Asia. Prior to returning to academia in 2013, Michael worked at the Global Affairs Canada as a Management Consular Officer. His areas of expertise include Turkic periodical history, Kurdish publishing, and historiography. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Michael. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today, and we all look forward to hearing your talk today. Thank you.
I'll have to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Rustin and Emma. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to share with you the talk that I'm about to present. So without any further ado, I'm going to start by sharing my screen and begin the presentation. So good afternoon to everyone. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good evening to those of you who are in Europe and further east. My name is Dr. Michael Erdman. I'm the curator of Turkish and Turkic collections at the British Library, and it's my pleasure to present and take another look, revisiting the British Library's Turkish and Turkic collections. So I've called it Take Another Look, for those of you who might not be familiar with the collections, in order to encourage you to take another look, a bit of a deeper look at what we hold and how the collections are organized. And for those of you who might be somewhat familiar with the collections, particularly with the historic collections, as an invitation to take another look at how the collections might have changed over the last few years, and how they are looking, or how I and we are looking forward to the future in building the collections for researchers and users around the world. So I'm going to do this today by first talking about the British Library and where we are and what we are as an institution, before going on to my specific fiefdom, my specific area of responsibility, looking at Turkish and Turkic collections, going on to a look first at the printed collections before discussing particularly manuscript and handwritten collections. And then we'll end with first a small bit of information about digitized materials and how you can access them. And finally, a little bit about outreach and the work that we do in trying to reach out to various different users and communities, and how that is informed by the collections we have and the goals that we have in doing it. So I'll start first and foremost at the beginning with the British Library. The British Library, for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar or are a bit familiar, is the State Library of the United Kingdom. I call it the State Library because there are it's often listed as the National Library, and there are national libraries as well in Wales and Scotland. And what's so unique about the British Library is it's funded, of course, through the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and it acts as sort of an adjunct to the British state. It's an arm's length agency or institution. The institution was founded originally in 1753 through the grant of a number of different collections to the then British Museum by King George III. So yes, that King George III, for those of you schooled in American history. And over the interceding centuries, the collection grew through the acquisition of various other collections, whether as bequests or through purchases by the workers at the British Museum. So public and private collections were gradually taken in, and eventually in 1973, this component, the Library of the British Museum, was changed by Act of Parliament into the British Library, a separate self-sustaining institution. And the library continued to acquire its own materials as well, and in 1998, officially moved into this building here in the center of the screen, this beautiful listed building, which is only steps away from platform 9 3/4, for those of you who are Harry Potter fans. The British Library is notable not only for the fact that it's over 2.5 centuries old, but also because it acts as the legal deposit for the United Kingdom. So it's one of 6 different institutions that takes in materials as a legal deposit, but it's the only one where it's a requirement for a publisher to deposit a printed or digital work. And it also is a store of national treasures. So you'll find things like the Magna Carta, the Ramsay Psalter here. You'll also find things like Virginia Woolf's notes and notes by the Beatles, Harold Pinter, contemporary national treasures relating to British culture, and of course also treasures relating to the cultures and histories and traditions of various peoples around the world. All of that together means that there are over 170 million items held at the British Library. And these are largely speaking text, but we also have sound, we've got image, we have video, and increasingly we have data. So that 170 million grows exponentially each year. And part of that has to do with the fact that we act as the archive, the Internet Archive for the UK. And we also increasingly will collect data and electronic items as well to add to our collections. The library, if you haven't had the opportunity to come and see some of the reading rooms or the collections, you might not know that perhaps the library is in many ways divided by language and culture. So there's a large collection that is divided again by time and type, that is in English and relating to the United Kingdom. But then there are also other sections of the library that we have based around Asian, African, European, and diasporic collections. This is largely done according to language. So within our section, where I work, which is the Asian and African Studies section or collections, you've got different curators and individuals who work with, for example, North Asia and North Indian collections or Persian collections. I work obviously with Turkish and Turkic collections. There are also sort of geographic and cultural collections in terms of, for example, the Africa collection. So this is perhaps a bit different from the way that other libraries are built, in the sense that we have a number of different guides as to how the collections and the expertise is divided. And another aspect of the library that I think bears remembering is that we are not actually area specialists, nor are we quite librarians. So one aspect of the library that's quite different, particularly in Asia and Africa, is that we are not necessarily schooled in library and information science. I am not by training a librarian, and many of my colleagues are not librarians by training either. We're not necessarily trained in archival studies, and neither are we necessarily area specialists or individuals who studied in area studies in particular. So there's a number of different skill sets, a number of different specialities and expertise that come together, as well as professional experience and expertise, in order to mold the curators who deal with the collections. This might also explain why, as we go through the presentation and as you deal with different individuals from the library, we're not always using a library and information science terminology or discourse when we're talking about the collections. It's because we're not necessarily from that tradition, but we might be from a number of different traditions that allowed us to specialize and focus on publishing and manuscript culture in a number of different languages or regions. So now that I've given you the broad overview of what the library is and how we're divided, a little bit about the collections that I deal with in broad brushstrokes. So I deal with the Turkish and Turkic collections, which roughly speaking account for 26,000 printed items and about 4,000 manuscript texts. Those are in about 2,000 different items, because if you've worked with manuscripts, you know that codices will often contain a number of different texts. But roughly speaking, there are about 30,000 texts by hand or by printing included within these collections. The collections account for over 30 different languages and dialects, all of them essentially members of the Turkic language family. So again, it's divided by a linguistic grouping. And then there's a separate collection that I also manage, which is the Kurdish and Zazaki collections, which are appended to these. And I'll speak a bit in a few moments about the rationale behind this. This I like to think of as the Turkic part of my title, essentially looking at a number of different languages, both dormant and active, in terms of the communities that use them, the texts that are produced, and essentially everything is accounted for according to these linguistic boundaries. They account for items, this is a bit of a cheat, I say between the 9th century and the 21st. Items from the 9th, 10th, 11th century are actually part of a different collection called the Stein collection, which is within the International Dunhuang project. But I do work with my colleagues within the IDP to ensure that there's proper cataloging and access to these materials from the earlier period. But then, of course, from about the 14th century onward, all of the Turkic textual materials fall within my area of responsibility. These text-based collections are complemented by sound and image. So you're seeing here on the far left-hand side of the screen a snapshot of the catalog for the sound archive. And we do have quite a few different examples of sound, whether it's music or it's spoken word in Turkic languages, that are curated by my colleagues in the sound archive. They're largely speaking ethnomusicologists, so they have a very specific professional training, and we often work together to ensure that linguistically everything is accounted for properly, as they then account for all of the materials as they know how to, as sound archivists and as ethnomusicologists. Images as well, colleagues of mine who work with images will work together to make sure, again, that these are accounted for and cataloged and curated in a way that reflects the linguistic and cultural sensitivities and information, as well as the physical format and stylistic information. So beyond that, there's also the aspect of the Turkish part of my title. And for that, I like to refer here to the idea of Turkish being sort of like the Turkish adjective Türkieli. So the idea of these collections are complemented as well by regional non-Turkic languages, specifically those attached to the broader Kulturbund of Anatolia. So we have collections as well, or small collections in languages such as Turoyo, Swadaya. Obviously, I've spoken about the Kurdish and Kurmanja or Zazaki collections as well, and Pontic Greek, Western Armenian rather, and Lazuri, as you can see here in the center of the page. All of these different languages that are then curated, sometimes by colleagues with whom I collaborate, sometimes by myself, in a way to ensure that because of their connection rather to the Republic of Turkey, that they're accounted for and tied to various different publishing cultures, as reflected as well by the dominant language in the Republic of Turkey, the Turkish publishing culture. And so the last group of materials that sort of complement this core Turkic collection are those in non-Turkic languages and amount to essentially Turkological scholarship. So I don't necessarily curate collections in English or Russian or French or Japanese or Swahili or Arabic that relate to studies of the Turkic languages and Turkic cultures, but I work with colleagues who do curate those languages to ensure that material that's produced, particularly secondary research that's produced in those languages, is acquired by the library and is accounted for and tied to the Turkish and Turkic collections as well, so that researchers can find those and use those in tandem with materials in Turkic languages. So I've given quite a lot of information about what the collections are in terms of their general structure. And now you're probably wondering, well, what's actually in the collections? So I'll start first with some of the printed materials, which account for the greater bulk of the lion's share, really, of materials within the Turkish and Turkic collections. Here, about half of the materials of the 26,000 materials are actually in Istanbul or Republican Turkish, Anatolian, contemporary Anatolian Turkish. We have about 13 to 14,000 items in this, followed by about 12 to 14,000 items in Ottoman. The other half of the printed collections are in a number of different languages, largely those national languages of the former Soviet republics like Azerbaijani, Uzbek, Kazakh, Tatar. And we, as I said, are probably over 30 different languages and dialects, it's an ongoing process of collecting materials. And generally speaking, we'd like to try to at least have representative collections of all of the different publishing cultures across Eurasia in the various Turkic languages. These printed materials go from about 1665 to 2021. And if you're familiar with publishing culture in the Ottoman Empire or in the Republic of Turkey, you're probably saying, well, wait a minute, you've mentioned Müteferrika. You have a Müteferrika piece up here on the right-hand side, and the Tarikh-i Hindut Garbi, a history of Ablayala, with some beautiful woodcut illustrations. That's from the 1720s, 1730s. What are you saying, 1665? Well, the library's collections also include Orientalist publications and proselytizing publications, polemics, and various other materials produced in Ottoman Turkish, a small corpus, but a notable corpus nonetheless, in Europe for export or for consumption in Europe itself. So I have here on the left-hand side, the Accepta Manuscripti Quisdam Turcici, which is essentially a critical edition of a manuscript. On the left-hand side, you see in Ottoman Turkish, on the right-hand side in Latin. So we really do account for the general history of the broadly speaking, history of publishing in Turkic languages, rather than just the history of publishing in a particular place or tied to a particular subject or individual. These historic collections, roughly speaking, account for subjects like literature, religion, history, administration, art, science, rhetoric, philosophy, essentially a lot of the subjects that were deemed to be of importance for Orientalists working in the 19th and early 20th centuries, for academia within the Anglo-American sphere, for colonial and imperialist organizations attached to the government or apart from the government, looking to really use collections like these to understand aspects of Turkic culture for whatever reason. So this is the core of the collections, especially when it comes to the printed materials. And that's often what you'll find when you look at the older materials pre-1945 in terms of printed items. Obviously, I've said that we have things that are from 1945 until 2021. So you'll probably see later on, and I'll speak a bit later on in terms of what comes after that as well. But when you're thinking about the early collections, the pre-45 collections, that's really what the core of this is, a servicing of academia and government interest in Turkic printing culture and Turkic cultural production as a whole. How do we account for these? Well, we have an online catalog which accounts for most items, but not all items within the collections that are printed. This is constructed if you're either if you work in a library or an archive, or you're a nerd, and perhaps you know Mark 21, and we use LOC authorities, so Library of Congress authorities. And so as you can see here for works at the top of the left-hand side, works that are in Cyrillic, that are in non-Latin scripts, we transliterate them. We also give the appropriate subjects that are listed as authorities. We try to list the authors that are given authorities and provide all of the information you'd expect in a catalog for a library when you go to any research library. And occasionally, however, there are certain things that don't necessarily fit neatly into the structures that are established by MARC and by the Library of Congress. So you have here on the left-hand side, for example, materials that are in the Latin script, the uniform alphabet, established by the Soviet Union in 1927 and applied to Turkic and other languages. And generally what you'll see is that there are enhanced original script entries. So essentially what we're trying to do here is to make sure that the titles reflect the broad diversity of Turkic alphabets and writing styles and cultural production across the ages. So I tend to mix when I'm cataloging as much as possible in terms of the different systems of use to capture really what you'll find on the books and to have that as part of the metadata that can then be downloaded and used in addition to the actual used to find the actual materials. Occasionally though, for those of you who are familiar with Turkic cultural production, with the changes in scripts, you'll know that there are certain aspects of the alphabet usage and publication or printing in Turkic languages that don't match what the Library of Congress has. Particularly, some of the Arabic script or the Arabic alphabets or scripts that were used for Turkic languages in the early 20th century have no system for transliteration according to the Library of Congress. What we do here, you'll see on the right-hand side rather, within the catalog, is that I've sought to break from sort of standard Orientalist practice within the library in the past, which would use usually Arabic or Persian guides to transliterate these titles. And instead, the idea is trying to bring them as closely as possible to the way in which the phonology works in Turkic societies today, and to reflect that within the catalog. So you'll see it's not necessarily a standard way of reflecting the Arabic script, as you would expect, say, with a Persian title, when it's rendered in Latin script and transliteration in the catalog. Nonetheless, the idea with the catalog is to provide as many access points to individuals who might want to use these collections, who might want to use these items, especially these very rare and unusual items that you won't find at a lot of research institutions. And so here, what I keep saying we, but really what I tried to do is I tried to use a lot of text fields to enhance the records. So you have Arabic script cataloging, you have sort of a makeshift transliteration, and then if you can see further down in the record as well, Cyrillic transliteration, contemporary Tatar used to transliterate these Arabic script titles, and then a standard Library of Congress transliteration to deal with that. So essentially what the idea of the catalog is to give as many different entry points to items that might be a bit more difficult to find through text fields, through other different means within the catalog, so that these items can then be discovered through their metadata and eventually used by researchers who might have need of them within their research projects. The collections that we have, as I mentioned, there are about 26,000 items, and you might be wondering, well, how did we get them? And this has changed over the 20th century. Originally, this was really between 45 and the 1990s, based on purchases and exchange. And so we would purchase materials from agents and from various different firms or concerns. But through the 60s and 70s in particular, there would be exchanges undertaken between the library and counterparts, especially in the former Soviet Union, at that point, the Soviet Union. So national libraries in Baku, in Kazan, in Almaty, in Tashkent would exchange with us materials, and we would provide them with English language materials, and we would get what was selected in a number of different topics, broadly speaking, the ones that I showed earlier, relating to the publishing cultures of the countries that they serviced. In the 90s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as neoliberal policies and followed by austerity policies in the UK, mean that the exchanges were slashed, and we were no longer in the business of selecting and changing and trading books with these countries. And we went into a system where what we do now is we purchase materials on the open market, and we also receive donations. You might think that this is sort of a step backwards. In some ways, perhaps it is, because it's hard to receive materials from certain countries like Turkmenistan without government intervention. But in another way, this opened up a new aspect of collections, particularly the ability to break from the definitions of acceptability and value. And here what we're looking at really is the idea of being able to say certain materials, which we perhaps would not have received before because they weren't by academics, because they weren't through academic publishing houses or through state-run publishing houses, could now be purchased and could now be added to the collections, widening what we saw was of greater value in terms of who produced material and where it was produced. This sort of changed the collections as well, and it really changed, again, the topics that we now collect. So we still collect on all of those topics that I mentioned before, but we also look at other topics such as gender, cinema, drama, popular arts, occult, COVID, LGBT+. The idea here is not necessarily to just have token representation of these things, but to really have a broad snapshot of what publishing cultures are in a variety of different countries around the world that use the Turkic languages. So here, the idea is having academic histories and academic publishers' works, but also, as you see on the left-hand side, Sanjara, or genealogical works from Kyrgyz publishers. The idea is having representation of minority communities that don't have access to large publishing houses, like Romani publishers from Turkey in the center. And then, of course, breaking with sort of standard topics that are sort of more hardwired into a lot of different Oriental studies programs, and looking at things like on the right-hand side, topics about abortion within Islamic law. So the idea here is to go from catering the collections towards a particular academic topic or a particular academic setting towards collections that are reflective, much more of publishing cultures within different countries and different languages and within different communities throughout those cultures and territories. I've spoken quite a lot about the printed material now, and probably quite a few of you are actually interested in looking at the manuscript material. So I'll move on now to the manuscripts to talk a bit more about what we have in terms of these historic collections. As I mentioned before, we have about 4,000 texts and about 2,000 items, so quite a few codices. And these do go from the 9th to the 20th century. So again, as you know, a bit of a fudge in terms of the 9th and 10th century materials. But by and large, the Turkish and Turkic collections in terms of manuscripts are from about the 15th century. So we have some old Anatolian or Khwarezmian Turkic materials going up to the early 20th century. So the outer end, if you're looking at manuscripts, we have a few things that are administrative or sort of scrap materials with writing on them from the early 20th century. We've got a few hangovers from after the switch of the alphabet in Turkey, so after 1928, of individuals who were still comfortable writing in Arabic script. And then we've got a few of the manuscript traditions. So we have, I think the latest is 1949, a collection of poets' biographies from Diyarbakir, from Ahmed, which was created by someone who still wanted to create a manuscript by copying from an earlier text. These are not almost all, but probably about 90% in Ottoman or in an Oghuz dialect. We have about 150 items in Eastern Turkic, but most of the items that we hold are in Ottoman. And when I say Ottoman, I really mean courtly Ottoman, roughly as close to what you could call sort of a standard Ottoman. But some of them do break from that, and there are other Oghuz dialects. So if you've read some of the blogs that I've written, you'll know that the far right-hand side, we have here the Leyli ve Mejnun. We have about 7 or 8 Azerbaijani manuscripts, so Eastern Oghuz dialects. We have one Puraga manuscript, we've got one in Turkmen, and we do have, generally speaking, a bit of linguistic diversity within the Ottoman section as well. Both the Ottoman and the Eastern Turkic ones have spectacular manuscripts within them. So if you're also interested not just in the text or in the language, but also in the art of book creation, of book production, of illumination, of illustration, as you can see here, not just Leyli ve Mejnun, but also in the center, the Divani Izzi, a 17th century work, some really spectacular examples of illumination and calligraphy, as well as gilding, that you can find throughout the collections. All of these manuscripts, in theory, are cataloged according to within a bespoke system that is online. So what does that mean? Well, I'll give you a bit more of an in-depth tour of what that means in the next few slides. So the manuscripts that we have, there are about 2,000 items that have to be accounted for. So we create a manuscript, a catalog entry for each item that we find in the collection. These, at the current time, there are about 700 to 800 different catalog entries for the Turkic manuscripts, which means that about 40% rather of the manuscripts are accounted for online. The rest are accounted for in printed manuals like the 1888 Rieux catalog, or they're accounted for in acquisition slips and acquisition registers, or they're accounted for in hand lists produced by my predecessor. Essentially what I'm saying here is the majority of the Turkic manuscripts require you to come to the library in order to find them. And we're trying to change this, and we're looking at a variety of different schemes to do this, but it's going to be a while until that's going to be possible. Right now, though, we're adding a number of different catalog entries, and I'm trying to do this while working from home. And obviously, the pandemic has made access to the materials very difficult. But the general scheme of cataloging here is that first, we try to find some sort of information about the content. So I've got all of these different guides. I've got acquisition materials, I've got hand lists, and I've got the 1888 catalog. And generally speaking, I'll go through and try to find the content of each of the items to then add to the online catalog. Here, I've given a 19th century Bektashi Mecmua, and I selected this one not just because it has lovely gilding and it's quite a unique item within the collections, but also because it brings up some of the issues about the content. So I rely on these materials that are a bit older in terms of the descriptions. And one of the things that I have to do is I have to go through and sort of clean them up a bit. So sometimes the language used is not appropriate. Sometimes the language used is inaccurate. Sometimes the descriptions have to be matched to some of the other material that we have in terms of new information that we've garnered about some of the manuscripts in the interceding years. And this sounds like it's a pretty simple process, but as Rustin said, my specialty is in historiography of the 1920s and 30s. I am not a manuscript specialist. I am not a specialist in Ottoman literature. So this is quite a lot of research on my side, and there's also quite a bit of guessing and learning on the job. So it's a slow process, and there are a lot of mistakes, and I'm very grateful when those mistakes are pointed out, particularly with things like this, the Bektashi text, where I don't necessarily know all of the terminology that's used and will have to rely on others. And that's another aspect of this, which is consultation. So consulting with colleagues at the library or consulting with colleagues outside of the library through a number of means to really understand what we're looking at and to create essentially what is a dynamic catalog. The catalog itself is very static and it's quite basic, so don't expect it to change very quickly. But it's dynamic in the sense that I often have to work with others to understand a bit more as people use the materials, and will provide feedback in terms of inaccuracies or perhaps information about the manuscripts that wasn't included in the original catalogs. This then means that we have to go through and we're kind of constantly recreating the catalog, as it were. And gradually, though, once we have something that can go in, there has to be a measure of consistency. So here, the Bektashi text, we don't have many Bektashi manuscripts within the collections, as far as I know. And so there isn't a lot of consistency that has to be imposed, but there are quite a few different collections or mejmualar where there might be, for example, divans, where there are a number of different copies of similar or the same texts within the collections. And there's then a process whereby I go back, and try to make sure that those records reflect the same information, roughly speaking, obviously with the addition of item-specific information, and also that they're all tied together, on the assumption that there might be some researchers or users who come in who say, I want to find all of the Lami Chalabi manuscripts that you have, and that are his divan or that are his munshiat. And so we have to try to provide something within the catalog that makes that an easy process and makes it sort of rational across all of the different items that we have. So with that, there are a few different issues that arise, obviously, when accounting for the manuscripts. So as I mentioned already, the idea of online cataloging, that's a long process. And I'm sort of harping on it a bit here because I think often we get asked, I can't find things, you don't have this, do you have this, I heard about this. Please be patient, I guess, is one request that I make, but also to understand that if you don't find it online, and the catalog record might still be waiting to be uploaded to the system or created on the system. So you might have to get in touch with me or other individuals at the library to find another means of finding some of these manuscripts and how to use them. Within that, though, there are other aspects of really creating useful and meaningful records for the catalog. And one of those is the identification of language, of origin, dating, and community for the items. So I've harped quite a bit on language in some of the blogs, if you've read some of the blogs that I've written, and I won't go into too much about it here. Essentially the idea, especially with the Eastern Turkic materials, of understanding what language they're in. The origin obviously deals with provenance, and that's something I'll speak about in a bit, but then also dating. So when we talk about origin and dating, roughly, the issues here are the idea of where does the manuscript come from in terms of a place, and also when is it from? As I mentioned, I'm not a specialist in Ottoman literature or really someone who dealt with a lot of manuscripts through my own research. So it's a learning process for me. And there are some cues, obviously, that we can take in terms of the calligraphy, the paper, the style of writing, the style of the formatting of the book and the binding and the illustration, all this. I'm gradually learning it. I'm working with others to understand a bit more. And so gradually what we're hoping is that that information will be added to the collection, to the collection pages in the collection catalog as it becomes available. And the last with community, I just want to raise here, because in the center you have an image here of Lami Çelebi's Münşiyatı. And this is a letter that Lami Çelebi says is in Uygurca. So he says Uygurca or Tatar Lehçesi. And it's interesting because the entire book, the entire Münşiyat, is actually in Ottoman. and then you've got 2 pieces within it that are in Uyghur. So when we talk about community, what I mean here is giving some information within the catalog that perhaps gives some indication of what this Minsheat was meant for. Because we have to ask, well, were all of the people who were going to use this Minsheat, this collection of correspondence, which might be used for didactic purposes to teach people how to write letters, or might be used for historical purposes of understanding Lami Chalabi's correspondence and intellectual oeuvre, were they expected to know Uyghur? Would they have wanted to learn how to write letters in Uyghur? What's the purpose of including multilingual materials within one collection? So it's a sort of a more in-depth idea of trying to create the catalog to really contextualize the works and understand how they would have functioned with each other and within a broader scheme. And finally, when we talk about origin, the idea of provenance. So all of the manuscripts, we have some indication of how they came into the library. And by that, I mean, the manuscripts often have at the end of the manuscript who bequeathed or sold the item to the library and when it was acquired. We also have acquisition registers. And the unfortunate thing is, as I'm cataloging at home and don't have access to the materials, that has to wait to go into the catalog if it's not readily available in the acquisition slip or in the hand list that I have. Sometimes it requires actual processing of the material of the item to know. But going beyond that and understanding how that person, the last point of contact before it entered the museum or the library, how they received the item, and that's a bit more of an in-depth study. It's going to take a lot longer to do, and it's going to take a lot more, many more skills and different individuals to really understand how this collection came about, who it was sourced from, who owned it, how it was passed through, and then how each of the texts might have been used. And so I have here the Basri Divana, a 19th century draft of a divan of poetry. And I've given it specifically because there are a lot of different issues that we have to ask. This is a draft, it's not a fair copy or a good copy, thinking sort of in publishing terms. So we have to ask, was this meant to be passed on as something to be sold and enjoyed by individuals? Or did perhaps someone take something that was used up after a fair copy had been produced? And why was it circulating? Why was it exported? Why was it taken away? And why was it added to the collection? So all of that sort of information about where it came from, how it was used, and how its use changed, that still has to be found out and then eventually added to the collections. Okay, so you've seen all of these wonderful manuscripts, and you're probably wondering, well, how do I actually access them? And the greatest, the standard rule of thumb is you have to come to London. And unfortunately, only 7 manuscripts from the collections are available online. 4 of these are Nava'i manuscripts, such as the one on the far left. And you have a Divani Nava'i from Herat from the 16th century with lovely decoupage. There's another manuscript that is from Central Asia, which is the Nusratnama, a history of the Chinggisid dynasties, which is available online. And then a Ruzname from the Ottoman Empire and an Ottoman Vakfia, which I've described in another blog. I'll talk about the blogs in a moment. All of these materials are available on bl.uk/manuscript. You can see the catalog entry point on the right-hand side. These are generally speaking high-resolution images, so it's very easy for you to zoom in and see the beautiful illumination and illustration, such as the middle Gharaib al-Saghar from the Ottoman Empire, a Nava'i poem, which is incomplete, unfortunately. And you can access them for free. So there's no need for you to register or for you to pay to actually see these collections. The unfortunate thing is that they're very few in number. In terms of printed materials, we only really have 2 printed items online, both in Kurdish, one a collection of Yazidi poems and another an Armeno-Kurdish prayer book from the 1870s. But unfortunately, as I said, these are not easy things to access. We're working on it, and we're hoping to get over the coming years more material online. But obviously, the pandemic, as you might be aware, has stalled the best laid plans. And so any projects that were out there where we might have been expecting to look at digitization or open up the ability for you to request digitized materials if you have the funding to pay for them, and those have been put on hold a bit because of the restrictions in place. So what I'd say is watch this space over the long term, both for information about how you might access materials that you can request to be digitized for yourself, and also which might be digitized and made available through the library on its own. So the last part of the presentation is talking about outreach, and specifically why I do things like this, and how I use social media, and how we as a library use social media and other platforms, and why we do it. The first thing I've mentioned so many times already, the idea of blogging. We blog quite a bit. We have quite a large blog presence at the library. And there are two blogs I want to talk about here. So the first one I want to talk about is the Asian and African Studies blog. This is a blog, I'm one of the editors. It's a blog that is maintained for the entire Asian and African Studies section. And this blog is great for providing quite a lot of access to context about the collections. So there are materials here, there are blogs here that discuss manuscripts, printed materials, other items, and events that touch on all of the different collections within the Asian and African Studies collections. And they provide quite a bit of context for these items within the collections. So if you're interested in a particular item, want some images perhaps, want some of the history behind it, and also want to know how it relates to other pieces within the collections, the Asian and African Studies blog is a wonderful resource. And I invite everyone to check it out and to really scour through, I think it's now about 8 years or 9 years of posts. Another one that I'll talk about is a personal blog that I maintain, which is from Untitled. This is a smaller blog, and it just really deals, it's just me writing things. The reason why I've done this is because I will talk about collection items, but here, rather than providing collection items and the context within the collection, I like to provide pieces with context in terms of the history around that item. So the publishing history around it, the cultural, socio-political context as well, rather than just the collections at the library. It's also great because I, as you have probably clued in now, I'm quite verbose. I have a bit of an issue with cutting myself down, and so maintaining my own site means I can write for as long as I want. The other aspect of engagement is with Twitter, and so you've probably seen quite a few of the different Twitter accounts connected to the library. My own here is Altay. Twitter is great for being able to post a lot of images, and if you're looking for images, I would recommend you go through the various Twitter accounts connected to the library because they have a lot of images, especially of items that are not digitized. So it's a great way for you to find snapshots of things that you might not be able to access, and also to really understand a bit more about what the collections contain beyond the catalog or beyond digitized manuscripts. The last one is something that I don't necessarily do that much, but the library does engage quite a bit on Facebook. So as you can see here, they like to put up quite a lot of videos, including from angles looking down on the presenters, which are unkind for those of us with thinning hairlines. But as you can see, it's more of a personalization thing. So you'll find some material here about the manuscripts and the collections, but roughly speaking, these are things to personalize what we do, to talk about our processes and why we came to some of the materials, why we're interested in them, and to get a bit more information about the library as an institution, as an organization, and an organism, rather than necessarily the collections as a whole. So why do we conduct outreach? Well, it's because we want to connect and communicate with communities. And here, essentially, it's an idea that, as I said, a lot of the collections were built with the idea of academia and with specific users. And what we're trying to do now is branch out and to make the library a bit more welcoming to others who are not necessarily in academia, to connect with communities that don't necessarily have a pre-existing relationship with the library, to let them know about the collections we have, and to really try to talk about the collections in different ways besides just academic or scholastic research. And also to then receive feedback from those communities about how the collections might be handled or contextualized. So I've got here both sort of ideas from Kurdish and Central Asian press. The idea, of course, with using social media, though, is that we have to navigate some of the controversy around it. So here I've got the idea of a bit of a discussion in Persian, because I used the term Azerbaijani for one of the manuscripts, which is common in the Republic of Azerbaijan for the way you would describe the language, but in Iran, often it's Turki that's used, or Turkcha. So the idea of, this opens us up in terms of outreach to other views, perhaps to controversies around the language used. Culture is inherently political. And so there's an idea here as we navigate these, as we try to put more material out, that this is obviously a dynamic relationship that we have. So in navigating the outreach and in trying to communicate with others and communicate with new communities, sometimes there's a point where we have to take stock and we might not necessarily be going forward with certain things as we learn to understand, again, the feedback we've received and how we might want to continue our outreach, our communication, our cataloging, and curation of the materials with this new information. So I've thrown a lot of information at you right now, and perhaps you're a bit overwhelmed. Perhaps you have a few questions, and I promise we are getting now to the Q&A part. But if you would like to ruminate on some of the material I presented, on some of the things that I've shown, and get in touch later, please do send me an email. I try to respond fairly quickly. You can also follow me on Twitter at Untitled. And then, of course, the two blog sites that I talked about from ultitujucher.home.blog and blogs.bl/Asian and African are, again, great resources if you want to learn a bit more about the collections and a bit more of the context around them. So with that, I'll end the presentation and go back to the plenary session, I suppose, to see what questions, comments, suggestions, thoughts you might have.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was fantastic. So I'll just begin with our first question. This is from Musa, and Musa asks, "Hi, Michael. There are many copies of the old Turkish materials like the Muqaddimatu al-Adab in different libraries around the world. How do you think about the idea of combining all these copies under their own name on the digital platform? Thus, we can see the copies of important works on a single platform. Do you have any work on this subject?"
So trying to, I guess, there are a few different things with there. I think it's a great endeavor to try to have sort of platforms that are dedicated to specific manuscripts. I know that there are a number of different manuscripts or projects around the world that are looking at that. So I think the one that I'm most familiar with is there's a Baki project, I believe, at one university in the US, where there's an idea of digitizing all of the Baki manuscripts and then providing access OCR to kind of create editable or searchable texts and creating one platform where you can find all of the Baki manuscripts that you might want to use for your research. I think it would be wonderful to be able to do that. As I mentioned, we only have 7 out of 2,000 items that are digitized. So I think we're a bit behind in being able to do that at this point in terms of our collections. I think it would be great to participate in those. And I know that we've spoken with a number of different institutions around the world about the idea of how materials that are digitized and housed at the British Library can be included in those projects. I think it's something that perhaps will have to be taken on a case-by-case basis, and that, as I said, on the face of it, is something wonderful, would be very useful to researchers around the world to be able to find one resource where you see everything. But I think it requires all of the different institutions to be up to speed in terms of digitization, and then also really having an understanding about how we digitize things. So I'm not someone who works with the technicalities of digitization, but I do understand there are different standards, there are different practices, and it would really require for us to have someone who, like the Baki project, would be a project manager to understand how we would kind of collate all of those images and work together to make something that is, at the end, so user-friendly that that you wouldn't have to really know, oh, this is a British Library manuscript, I'm going to deal with it like this, and that's from the Mili Kutupane, I'm going to deal with it like that. So it would be great. We don't have anything on the go right now, but hopefully in the next 5 years or something, perhaps we'll have something in the works.
Thank you. We have another question from Sumayed. Many thanks. Could you talk about sources, newspapers, novels, printed archival material about Turkey from the Foreign Office, etc., for the period of the early 20th century, say 1900s to 1930s?
Great. So this is actually something that we have in spades. We have a lot of material like this. I didn't mention it in my presentation because it's not actually part of my area of responsibility. So since I deal primarily with Turkic language material, if this is in English, it's actually usually in, if it's sort of produced by a government office, in the India office records. Those you can find if you go to the British Library's website and look for archives and manuscripts. You should be able to search the vast majority of those materials in terms of their top level subjects. And we have a lot of material that relates to foreign office operations, reports, and other such material that was sent back to London regarding the Ottoman Empire, regarding the Republic of Turkey. Occasionally those do have photographs attached as well. And so they're underutilized but highly valuable sources of information about British, Ottoman and British Turkish relations as well at the start of the 20th century. The other aspect that I'd invite everyone to check out is the same catalog. So going to the Archives and Manuscripts catalog and going to the Western manuscripts, or searching through Western manuscripts for some of the ambassadors from the British Empire, from the United Kingdom to the Ottoman Empire. So there's actually quite a lot of material in the personal papers from some of these individuals who are diplomats that relates directly to relations between the two countries. I've worked specifically with Sinan Kuneral in Istanbul, looking at the Layard papers. So there's quite a lot of research that's been done on Layard and what sort of material his archive contains about early sort of the Gladstone period of relations between England and the Ottoman Empire. There's still a lot of other different diplomats whose papers have not been mined for this sort of material. And it's a really rich vein, again, for research to open up an understanding of conditions in the Ottoman Empire at that time, and also the relationship between England or Britain and the Ottoman Empire, and then going into the Republic of Turkey.
Thank you. I have my own question, which is about the Asian and African Studies blog, which is, I love it. It's a fantastic resource. And my question is specifically about how you go about choosing specific topics for articles. Like, I mean, you've worked on specific manuscripts, you've talked about particular language collections, but in your own mind, as you're planning out, a schedule, like what do you, I know you said that you like to shed context on the materials, but like, how do you actually formulate a cool topic or something that you would find interesting?
So I guess I'll talk in a broad sense about it. So as one of the editors, I see a lot of different materials that come through, and I deal with a number of different contributors. And I think often it's people are working on something. They really get stuck on, they've got a collection that they have to work on, and they just find all of this information and don't know where to put it. It doesn't go into the catalog, but it's also not really a research paper. So something in between, and the blog really helps. And for me, I think I've really come to the blog as a way to publicize the materials. I get quite excited about certain aspects of the materials. Often what happens is a researcher will come in and say, I'm trying to look at, materials from East Turkestan. I'm trying to find materials on this particular individual, on Ali Pasha. And so I'll help them, and I'll go through and find all sorts of materials, and they go off and take these materials and use them. But I'm, again, left with all of this research that I've done, that I'm kind of like, well, I'm not a specialist. I can't really create a paper about, East Turkestani manuscripts, because that's not my field. I would have to go out and learn so much more. But I also can't put it into the catalog because it's just too much information. And I think that's where I've come to the blog and said, oh, well, I've got all this information. I think there would be more people out there who would be interested in learning about how we determine the languages of these manuscripts, in learning about all of the different vakfias that we have. So I'm going to put it together and have it as a blog, and this way then just be able to refer people back to it if they're, if someone comes up and says, I'm going to be doing research on this topic, to be able to have that up there so that they can then go back to it and really begin to pick out all of the different references to the manuscripts or to the collection items.
Excellent. And just because I'm selfish, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll return to the chat. My next question is about digitization, and as you mentioned that you're not, an expert on, the technical dimensions of digitization. But one of the questions I had is, what sort of priorities does the British Library and specifically the Turkish and Turkic collection has for digitizing manuscripts? Like, I know obviously things are kind of put off right now, but in terms of, how, if, let's say things were back in order, like we were back to normal and whatever a future normal will be like, how would you as a curator decide what's next for digitization? Is it patron driven? Is it something that you think that a particular manuscript has been, you think that it would kind of benefit to be online? So how do you kind of go about that decision?
So in general, in the library, there's kind of two tracks. There's one that's sort of all in within the library, and then there's another one with funding. And so if you have an institution that comes to you and says, I've got this pot of money and I'd really like to see all these manuscripts, that kind of eases things a lot more, right? Because it's a funded project. You can have a dedicated photographer, or you can have someone who can, we can have more resources dedicated to the creation of these digital works. And that's how we had the Muhammad Ali Pasha Vakfiyeh digitized. But then when it's driven inside the library, we have to look at different aspects of why we would want materials digitized. Sometimes it's that they are very fragile. So sometimes I have materials within the collections that are so fragile that I think if someone uses this more than 5 times, it's going to go to dust. So I want it to be used first by a curator, a conservator, and then by a photographer, and have a surrogate. And beyond that, though, there's really just a question of patron-driven demand. So one project that I'm quite passionate in seeing go forward is the digitization of 39 East Turkestani manuscripts, so Uyghur manuscripts, Eastern Turkic manuscripts from, roughly speaking, the Tarim Basin, Altı Şehir. Here, this is driven by the fact that there's been a lot of demand to use these and to see these. It's driven as well by the idea that this is heritage related to a community that is under considerable stress in terms of cultural preservation and does not necessarily have access to the same sort of materials to be able to see these. And I think it's really within the interest, given that they're held at the library, to make these available online so that communities, diaspora, can be able to access them in order to use them as they see fit as well, because they're not very easily accessible if you're not in London. So that's one of the main drivers. And then there's another aspect, of course, which is the idea that sometimes things are just not found elsewhere. So if there are items that are really rare, we're the only one that holds something, within Western Europe and North America that's similar. Then I think there's also an idea of trying to digitize some of these items just to make them available so people don't have to expend the money that they would to come to study them.
Thank you. I believe two audience members had similar questions about the digital manuscripts. One was asking, do you expect to scan more in the future, which I believe you said that there is a plan once COVID we're out of this lockdown mode. And then the other question was about the specific link to accessing these 7 digitized manuscripts. You mentioned the bl.uk.manuscripts, but is there an easier way to search them? Should you just type in language, or how would you go about finding them in the search bar?
Yeah, I guess the easy answer is sort of that the search platforms are not the greatest. One easy way is just if you know the code for, say, like the shelf mark. Usually it's OR, sometimes it's add MS, and then the number of the manuscript. That's one way that you can find it, by just searching that through Google. And often you won't pick up on the catalog entry, but you'll pick up on an entry in a blog, or you'll pick up on an entry somewhere else, which will be hyperlinked back to the actual site where the digital surrogate is found. Otherwise, often what I think the shelf mark is a good way if you're searching on bl.uk/manuscripts. And another way is just if you search Ottoman or Chagatai, and that should usually bring up the manuscripts that you're looking for.
Great, thank you. I will say that we're over time. We have one more question here. So if everyone bears with me, it'll be nice just to answer that last question before we go. Before we get into that question, somebody has asked about whether this presentation will be made available. yes, thanks to all the work that Emma Harbour has done. We will have a recording of this presentation up on UNC's YouTube page, the UNC Center for Middle Eastern Studies. So if you're, check back with us on social media and you'll be able to find this recording. And so for our last question, before we go, it's by Saeed, and he says, are there any projects by the British Library planned that have to do with manuscript collections in state libraries in the countries of the former USSR? Could you tell, if you know of them, could you kind of share with us?
So we maintain relationships with all of the national libraries, I think except Turkmenistan. We don't necessarily have relationships with the national libraries in all of the former Soviet republics that speak Turkic languages. We do work on sort of ad hoc projects. There has been one where we've shared digital surrogates of manuscripts, of Navoi manuscripts, not with the National Library in Uzbekistan, but with the Alisher Navoi University of Uzbek Language and Literature. I always get this wrong, in Tashkent. So we contributed to their digital library of manuscripts. And so we hope to work further with other institutions. We've talked to a number of different institutions in Kazakhstan, both the National Library and the National Academic Library in Astana. I've been to the National Library in Baku as well. And sometimes we don't necessarily have firm projects, but what we do is we look to trade information and gradually look at specific items that might be of interest that perhaps could be digitized. And so unfortunately, I know that my colleagues who work in, for example, in the Hebrew manuscripts project or in Chinese manuscripts, that they have dedicated collections that are shared with national libraries around the world. We don't have anything that is specific like that, and we don't have a project that would see that created. But there are small things that pop up, particularly right now with Uzbekistan and a bit with Kazakhstan as well. And we're hoping that those will be formalized into something a bit more solid that we'll be able to share in the future. But right now, it's really only the State University of Uzbek Language and Literature in Tashkent that we've had any sort of firm project where those manuscripts have now become part of their collections.
Michael, I just want to say thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. This was a fantastic presentation, and I think I speak on behalf of the audience to say that we were so happy to have you here. And yeah, we just thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to be here. I had a great time, and I'm looking forward to communicating with everyone. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, to reach out and to continue the discussion.